Welcome to the Sex, God, and Chaos podcast, a conversation built to help you address the mess, connect the dots, and defeat addiction. Doing your work matters because if nothing changes, then nothing changes. Life is tough and we're here to help. I'm your host, Ben Derrick, and as always, I'll be joined by Roan Hunter. Let's jump right in.
We've got a repeat a repeat guest today. Excited to have Tullian joining us again to talk about mainly today we're going to talk about his book that is getting ready to come out, new book. He's written many books, but this is the first endeavor that he's had after kind of going through hell and back. And I've read the book, most of all of it, and boy, it is a powerful message of what grace is all about. The title of the book is Carnage Grace, Confessions of an Adulterous Heart. And man, it is excellent. So Tully, dude, glad to have you back in the studio with us, and looking forward to the book getting out there. I've already just told several people, man, you got to read this book when it comes out. It's some powerful, powerful stuff.
Well, thank you, Roan. It's good to be back with you. I'm pretty picky and choosy about which podcasts I jump on. And when I was thinking about the book and as it's coming out, what podcasts I would like to be on, yours is at the top of the list. So thank you for having me back. And you said it right. I am a repeat offender. I know I'm a repeat guest, but I am absolutely a repeat offender. So
you and me both.
Nailed it.
Yeah, that's right. I understand it well. In the book, certainly it's your story, most of it around your very public failure, and just the realness is refreshing. One of the things you said in the book that I love, we talk about this, it's this idea of there's a lot of Christians today, people that say, oh yeah, I'm broken and I'm a sinner, but it's very vague. And then, when sin actually happens and it comes out and it gets specific, boy, we don't practice this thing called grace when we get honest, rigorously honest and specific with our sin. You talked about that in the book. I love that.
Yeah, and sadly, that's true. I had somebody once say to me, people love it when you stand up in front of them and say, I'm broken just like you are, I'm fallen just like you are, until you do something that broken and fallen people do. And then it's social exile. And I think there is a sense of safety in saying generically, I'm imperfect, I'm broken, I'm a sinner, I'm a fallen person. But then, like you said, when you start describing and getting specific about those particular areas of brokenness or fallenness or sin, the room gets real quiet real quick. And there's a huge, I talk about this in the book, but there's a huge difference between grace on paper and grace in practice, a huge difference between those two things. And, I haven't found too many people of faith that don't believe in grace on paper. But there are very few that actually believe grace in practice when the shit hits the fan, whether in their life or someone else's life. Grace it's like we throw it out the window. We forget what it's all about. We forget what it is. So yeah, I talk about that, and I don't spend a whole lot of time in the book talking about the failure of the church or the failure of the Christian community in handling real sin in the camp. I do talk about some of that only because as a result of my openness about my own story, my own adultery and crashing and burning and all that stuff, and the loss that comes after that, the guilt that comes after that, the shame that comes after that, the social exile that comes after that, people have opened up and sent me letters from all over the world because they too have experienced something like that. And even though the circumstances may be different in all the letters I receive, there's this common thread of the Christian community being the scariest rather than the safest place for fallen people to fall down and for broken people to break things. And I would like to think that that would change at some point. I don't have a whole lot of confidence that it will. I think we're kind of stuck with what we got. And I was telling someone the other day that when you find a small enclave of people that actually believe it, stick with it. I mean, there are those small sanctuaries, those small enclaves and refuges out there where, we have one here at the sanctuary in Jupiter. And man, I'm telling you, it is life-giving to be a part of a community of people who are self-aware enough to know their weaknesses and to know their struggles and to be open and honest about that stuff, and to have a room full of people who don't blink at honest confessions is a real gift. And so I love the fact that those places exist. I just don't think it's going to become a popular thing in the current evangelical industry that exists. It just won't be. And my friend Paul Zoll is quick to remind me anytime I get optimistic or hopeful that it might all change for the better, he's quick to remind me, he's such a historian, and he's quick to remind me that the message of grace has never been well received by the religious community. Never. And it never has been, and it most likely never will be. And so when you find it, you kind of hold on to it with everything you got.
Man, well said, my friend. I've been in recovery from my full-blown sexual addiction since 1990. And, certainly your friend Paul Zoll is spot on, because it's just, it just doesn't happen. The norm is certainly kind of what happened to you. I always say Christians, we not only shoot our wounded, we also gut them and eat them. It's and I've just seen it over the years. You kind of detailed your exit, your dissociation from Coral Ridge and the Presbyterian Church, and every one of those situations that, as a counselor, I've been involved in, those situations with the presbytery and the session and some kind of form of church discipline or correction. But not one time have I ever seen that go well.
Yeah.
And, most of the time it's doctors, lawyers, business people, and there's no counselors, there's no people helpers that are usually part of that process. And boy, the wounding and the way it's handled, it's just mishandled. And that's just
I've seen
real.
The same thing. Unfortunately, I've seen the same thing. And, the truth of the matter is, while discipline is certainly a good thing and is necessary, oftentimes we take matters so much into our own hands that we don't allow God to be the primary disciplinarian. And, another thing my friend Paul Zoll told me years ago was that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And to be honest with you, when I was under consideration, when everything came out and my affairs were made public, the presbytery that I was a part of, the head of the committee that deals with issues regarding ministers, sat down with me and basically outlined the process. They said, "Listen, I need a written confession from you," which I did, and then we will discuss it. And we will decide at that point on one of two avenues. One would be to put you through sort of a disciplinary restoration process, and the other would be to just simply defrock you, strip you of your credentials, and you're no longer a minister in our denomination. And never had a meeting with the presbytery, never had a meeting with even that committee, just that guy. And I understand some of the pressure they were under because my situation was so public and people were watching everything they were doing. And they decided to go ahead and just defrock me. My defrockment was my discipline. And there are narratives out there that say, a disciplinary process was offered to me and I fled from justice. That's just categorically false. That never happened. But I'm glad that they chose that path, because at that time I was on a mission to get everything in my life back. And I would have said anything, done anything, faked everything, jumped through any hoop they put in front of me just for that reason. Just to get my old life back, to get my status back, to get my role back. I mean, I can feign repentance with the best of them. I can fake that stuff and everybody would believe it. And so I'm glad they didn't offer me that, because I would have faked it. And it would have most likely prolonged sort of the whole process of coming to the end of myself and allowing God to do his deconstructive work. So the disciplinary process and the restoration process that God himself put me through over the years, that I outline in stages throughout the book, was far more effective. It was harder than anything any denomination could have come up with. It was longer than anything any denomination could have come up with. It was more painful and at the same time incredibly effective and very liberating and very unconventional. I mean, there's no denomination on the planet that would have written this process out for me the way God did. And I'm very grateful for that. So, it's, unfortunately, we don't do this stuff very well. And there are lots of opinions out there from people. Anytime a person falls publicly, everybody has something to say about it, even though they don't know the details of the situation and all the people involved. People say stuff about it. They talk about it. They get a lot of clicks on their website or on their social media pages because they talk about it. And, it gives the impression that the church doesn't know what the hell they are doing when someone, especially an esteemed leader, crashes and burns. I talk about that process some in the book, but ultimately it's a book about it. I set out to write a very raw, real memoir of the last 10 years of my life. Actually, I go back to about 2012, so 14 years of my life or so, or 12 years of my life. But I really wanted people to get a sense of how God's grace meets us in the darkest corners we find ourselves in. And so in order to do that, I had to talk about my dark corners. Some of those dark corners are well known to people, and some of those dark corners I am exposing for the first time in this book. And that was really, really hard to do. I had to relive some of the most difficult moments of my life. There are stories in there about my kids and how they reacted and responded to all of this and the damage that was done to them. There are stories in there about my ex-wife and how this damaged her and, all of that stuff. I mean, it wasn't easy to do. In fact, I had a great editor who pulled stuff out of me that I would have rather kept concealed. But it was incredibly difficult, incredibly painful. I cried more tears in the 18 months writing this book than I think I did in all the years of my life previously. And my wife and daughter can testify to that because they both live with me. So in that sense, it was very difficult. But man, it was so cathartic, and it was surprisingly healing. I didn't set out to write this book because I needed more healing. But in fact, in writing this book, I experienced some really deep healing that I don't think could have happened had I not written the book.
One of the things you write about is just the previous books that you had written. And, I had read those back in the day and had listened to you, along the way. But you mentioned this was from One Way Love. Grace is being loved when you're unlovable. And certainly that was pre-fall or pre-discovery and all of that. And you just talk about like how after you actually go through this stuff, you could write it's a great quote, right? But after you go through it, you really understand what it really means. And, before that, it's kind of a way of speaking and a platitude. And, it's just, grace is, loving the unlovable.
Yeah.
and then you're in it. It gets real.
It's very different. I talk about the difference between getting grace and grace getting us. And the difference between, like I said before, grace on paper and grace in practice. And the fact of the matter is, I don't think you can go from getting grace to grace getting you without some kind of crash and burn. It doesn't have to be something catastrophic. It doesn't have to be public. It doesn't have to be something that is, destructively ruinous across the board. But simply something that gets you to the point of realizing I'm out of resources. I can't fix me, and I can't fix this. Some people experience this as parents with their children who have gone off the deep end, and no matter what they do or what they try or what they say, they can't seem to woo their child back. And they get to a point where they realize, I'm not in control, and I've never been in control, and that makes me feel internally chaotic and scared. And so for different people, it's different things, different circumstances that get them to that place of desperation and realization. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think you can go from one to the other without destruction of some sort, pain, loss, suffering of some sort. I think that is key. And you see that throughout the Bible also. And ironically, someone asked me last week, how has your theology changed over the years? And I said, interestingly, my theology hasn't changed. If anything, I've just dug deeper where I already was, but it hasn't changed. It's just that it's become so much more real to me than it was before. And I believed it before, and I wrote about it before. I preached about it before. I was known as the grace guy in some religious circles, so it's not like I wasn't out there saying these things. But crashing and burning and doing so publicly, that forces you to reckon with God's forgiveness of you in such a way that it just softens you over time. I said in a sermon not long ago that I think I'm probably more forgiving now than I used to be. And it's not because I've read books on forgiveness or listened to sermons on how to be a better forgiver. I haven't even set out to try and be a better forgiver. I have just spent years now coming to terms with God's forgiveness of me in the face of my many failures. And over time, that just sort of softens you, and you wake up one day and go, wow, I don't hold grudges as easily as I used to. And I haven't even been trying. And it's just a good reminder that we all say in theological circles that, justification is God's work and sanctification is a cooperative work between us and God. And I got to tell you, my experience has been justification is all of God's work and sanctification is all of God's work because, I didn't go from where I was 10 years ago to where I am now in terms of just mental, spiritual, and emotional health, because I really devoted myself to being a better man. That was not the case at all. It was God doing his work in me at times very painfully, setting me free from things that I didn't even know I was enslaved to and continuing to do so. And that sort of has not only increased my trust in God, that he will in fact do the work, But it's also sort of decreased my trust in myself, which I think is a very healthy thing. When our trust in God goes up and our trust in ourselves goes down, I think we're on the right track.
Amen. Yeah, when you talking about the sanctification, justification, and imputation, all the great theological terms, and you write about it in the book when you were kind of did the Willow Creek stint, and you're sitting on the stage with theologians talking about these great, wonderful concepts of grace. And all of a sudden it kind of hit you, I think, and you said something like, God, who the hell cares?
Yeah, that's
beautiful. Yeah.
No, it's one of my favorite stories that I write about in the book. All of that happened about 6 to 7 months after my very public crash and burn, and I sort of in the book I talk about the context surrounding that particular conference that I was at, where I was on the panel, and these were all friends of mine on the panel, people who we used to host a large conference in Fort Lauderdale every year called Liberate. And the people that were on stage that day with me were the same people that I would bring in for Liberate. So these are people that I knew for a long time, friends. And we were having the same kind of discussion that we would always have when we were at Liberate on stage talking about these things. Like you said, talking about, beautiful, big theological concepts like justification and imputation and God's grace and all of that stuff. And while the conversation was smart, it wasn't helpful, because what very few people knew at that time, even though on the outside I looked like I was on the road to recovery, and yes, I crashed and burned, but I was now owning it and had come to terms with it. I was bona fidely suicidal at that time. My divorce had just been finalized. My family was completely broken up. My reputation was shot. I hurt a lot of people that I knew and loved especially, but also people that I didn't know, who looked to me as a spiritual leader of some sort. I was just reeling in guilt and shame and sadness and loss and regret and all of those things. And I was sitting on that stage listening to that conversation, participating in that conversation like I had many, many times before, and thinking to myself, who the hell cares? I just need someone to tell me why I shouldn't put a bullet in my head today. Like that, I'm suffocating here under the weight of my own struggle. I need help, and I need it bad. And as lofty and as factual as this conversation was, it was not helpful at all. It's like the substance was there in a sense, but the truth wasn't. And I needed desperately, I needed hope. And I decided, I sort of consciously decided sitting on the stage that day that if God were to ever give me any kind of platform again, small, big, didn't matter, didn't care. But if God were to ever give me an outlet to speak, to write, to minister again, it would now be to a completely different group of people. Not that the former audience would not gain from or pay attention to what I would say thereafter, but I became neduring that season so connected to the recovery community. I thankfully never had a substance abuse problem, but I have family members who have been in recovery for a long time. Lots of friends, people that I've met in the last 5-6 years. And I discovered pretty quickly after connecting with those communities and those people that these are my people. Even though what we are recovering from may be different, we're all in recovery, and we all know we're in recovery. And I do spend a significant amount of time in the book talking about that and trying to help people understand what recovery is. We tend to think of people in recovery programs from things like alcohol and drugs and sex and that sort of thing, overeating, whatever. But if you're a human being, you are in recovery. We have learned to cope with the hardness of life by connecting ourselves to unhealthy things, whatever that might be. by having an unhealthy relationship with something or someone. And so we're all in recovery. We've all felt rejected. We all have insecurities. We all have fears. We all deal with secrets that we either had or currently have. And so we're in recovery. So I say all the time these days that there are really two kinds of people in this world: people in recovery who know that they are, and people in recovery who think that they aren't. But there's nobody who's not in recovery. And so there's a strong recovery element to this book from beginning to end. And I suppose that as I connect even more so with the recovery community in the years to come, that if I ever write another book or books, every single one of them will have a very, very strong recovery theme running throughout, because that is the community that I belong to now. And it's it's a hell of a lot healthier than some of the communities I belonged to before. Way healthier. I mean, it is so much more refreshing to sit in a room with people who know that they're bad than with people who think that they're good. So much more refreshing. So I'm grateful for the crash, the burn, the magnificent defeat of my former life, because without it, I wouldn't be where I am now.
Yeah, I remind people often that, Jesus, the first time he ever speaks in public, he talks about recovery, right? He says, "I came to bring recovery of sight to the blind."
Yeah.
That's all of us unaware people of just like all this stuff that's up underneath the surface in our lives that we're not dealing with. And so, recovery, I think, is just the idea of like, I am recovering the life that God intended me to live from the beginning before all hell broke loose.
Yeah.
And so, yes, we're all in recovery. And, the thing that just being around church world and recovery world, it's like this, in church world, the recovery people are, we're those people. In reality, it's just, recovery, it is the Christian, it is the journey of transformation. Man, we're all in recovery, and certainly in the book, gosh, you had me at hello when you're quoting Mike Yaconelli and Brennan Manning, and you got a Rich Mullins quote in there, and Yaconelli's book Messy Spirituality was like
one of the best books out there.
Incredible.
Interestingly, I just saw a post from Russell Brand. Who is someone that I admire from a distance.
Yeah.
Because he's very vocal about his own journey in recovery. But I just saw a post by him a couple weeks ago where he was holding up Messy Spirituality.
Oh, wow.
And he said, this book was recommended to me, and I can't wait to dive in. And then 2 days later, he posted a reel on Instagram where he was reading 2 pages out of it. So I had to comment. I was like, dude, this book is the gold standard. When people ask me, especially if they are wrestling with the idea of grace, and they ask me for a list of books they can read, Mike Yaconelli's book, Messy Spirituality, and Brennan Manning's book, Ragamuffin Gospel, are the 2 primary books I recommend. And so it was super encouraging to see that Mike's book was getting some significant airtime and being exposed to a much larger audience and a much different audience than it probably has been before. So, yeah, those guys, I never had the privilege of meeting either of those guys. And I wish I had, because there's no doubt that I would be good buddies with them, no doubt. But yeah, that's, I kind of, guys like them, even Philip Yancey.
Oh, yeah.
Been super helpful. He's been a friend over the years, and he's been super helpful to me and very encouraging to me. Even after my crash and burn, he's been very encouraging to me. People like that who are well acquainted with church life, who understand that something's missing in this community, something, the fundamental tenet of grace seems to be missing. And even when it's spoken about, there are always caveats, always. Like, I heard more growing up in church, I heard more about what grace wasn't than what it was. Anytime grace was brought up, whether it was in my Christian schools or youth group or Sunday school classes or whatever, every time grace was brought up, it would talk very, the teacher would talk very generically about God's grace and God's love for us, but then it was quickly followed by, now this doesn't mean that you can go out and sin and so I learned there was so much more airtime given to what grace wasn't than what it was. And I think those guys, in a lot of ways, at least in the 20th century, late 20th century, those guys were pioneers. They were recovering a message that had been lost for so long, and because it had been lost for so long, it seemed new to people. It seemed novel to people. And I say all the time, I'm like, listen, this message, people will come up to me and be like, oh my gosh, your message is changing my life or something like that. And I'm very quick to go, listen, this is not my message, first of all. And it's not a new message. It's just so old and it's been lost for so long that it seems new, but it's really not. And whether you're talking about people of faith or people who aren't of any faith, no one can deny our own thirst for grace, especially in the face of our screw-ups. I mean, everybody, you don't have to be a Christian to go, I really screwed up, I hope my wife forgives me. I really screwed up, I hope my kid forgives me. I really screwed up and did a lot of damage, and I hope my father forgives me or my son forgives me or whatever the case. I mean, there is this universal longing for grace, especially when we screw up, especially when we crash and burn, when we hurt someone that we love. And so I said, this isn't, somewhere in the book, I think I said, or maybe it was just to the publisher, but I said, this is not a book for Christians and it's not a book for non-Christians. This is a book for human beings. Yep. Men, women, people of faith, people not of faith. I'm just telling my story and telling it in a way that is raw, unedited, embarrassing, and yet I'm also, in telling you those parts of my story, going to point to the only hope I found in the desert, which is the hope of God's grace. And so, yeah, I'm both excited and a little nervous about its upcoming release, to be honest with you. I mean, I'm going to stand in the public square with no clothes on, and that's not a very easy thing to do.
Yes, but I think we talked about this on the last time you were on. It's like, man, that is where our freedom lies, though. It's like when hey, here I am, the good, the bad, the ugly, the warts, the toe fungus, I don't know, whatever. Man, it's that's our freedom.
It is.
Because now I don't have to hide. I don't have to worry about somebody finding something out about me. Because I don't know, man, it's all out there.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And we keep accumulating things along the way. Yeah. So, I'm like, okay, a lot of the secrets that I had have been exposed, but what about the ones I have now? And what about the ones I'll have tomorrow? Yeah. And what about the ones I'll have in 2 years from now? Yeah. I mean, we all have PhDs in secret keeping. And so that's why recovery is a lifelong process. It's not like we arrive at some place. It's that we're journeying toward a place that we will not fully arrive at in this world. Mm-hmm. It is a lifelong process. And the people that I know who are in recovery, who stay sober, for example, are people who recognize that their recovery is a lifelong process. The people who relapse most frequently are people who go through the process of recovery and they get to a point where they think, okay, I'm good. I'm on the other side of it. I'm good. And that's always an incredibly dangerous place to be. So I can't imagine ever crashing and burning the way that I did and bottoming out the way that I did and all of that stuff. But at the same time, I'm like, dude, I know I'm capable. And as long as I know I'm capable, It helps me keep shorter accounts with myself. It helps me be a little bit more honest. I don't get to a place where I think, I've got this. That's never going to be a temptation for me, or that's never going to be a problem for me, or that's never going to be an issue for me again. I just assume that all of the issues I've always had, I will always have. And I think that's probably, that acceptance is such a key component to recovery. I don't believe that the demons we have will ever go away. I think it's not a matter of us ridding ourselves of our demons as much as it is acknowledging that they are there and recognizing where they reside. And then that information helps you to prevent them from controlling your life. But the moment you think you're back in control and you've got this licked and you're good, you're on the other side now, that's when you're in trouble.
Oh, dude, the victory Christians they're gathering the torches and pitchforks right now as you speak. Right?
Yes, they are. I have no doubt. and you know, the funny thing is, when I talk to recovery people, a lot of them will give some testimony. Most of them aren't church people, but some of them will give some testimony to time spent in church.
Oh, yeah.
And at the time, they were very well aware of their own internal struggles and the secrets they were keeping and the places they were going and the things they were doing. And yet there was so much talk about victory and conquering and all this stuff that it just disconnected them, because they're like, this doesn't even correspond with reality. Like, I need a God who saves the faithless, not the faithful. Mm-hmm. I need a God who curls up on the bathroom floor with me and weeps with those who weep. I need a God who understands that my struggle has always been and will always be, because you can oftentimes be looked at as a second-class Christian if you haven't rid yourself of all of the problems that you had 5 years ago. And I've just, I say this in the book, and I say it all the time. I have finally arrived at the very freeing place of being able to admit that my life doesn't look like Jesus. My life looks like someone who needs Jesus. and I think in the end, that's what glorifies God the most. You know, it's what glorifies a water fountain. You coming thirsty and drinking, period. And so, bringing our strengths and bringing our victories and all of that stuff, that stuff wears thin on me. Oh, yeah. And it discourages a lot of people from Christianity who struggle.
It certainly does. Rich Mullins, I think it was one of his songs, but it's just that idea, we're not as strong as we think we are. All right.
Right.
And I think all of us in our faith journey, we kind of start out and we get on the knowledge and performance track. And if I just, get more Bible and pray harder, whatever that means, I'm going to get better and better and better. And somehow I'm going to arrive at nirvana. And, the great thing about our crashes and burns is man, God just says, no, that's really stupid. And then he brings us to our knees, literally. And then we kind of figure out that man, I actually may need a savior. Every minute of every day. And I may need to be dependent on him. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true. No, I quote a psychiatrist by the name of Patricia Deegan in the book, who wrote an amazing article on recovery. Not a person of faith, as far as I know, but wrote an amazing article on recovery, probably the most insightful article on recovery that I've ever read. And she works with people in recovery. She's in recovery herself, and she talks about recovery being a growing acceptance of our limitations. And I love that, because that is a realistic view of the human condition, and the fact that I remain a broken person and this remains a broken world, and I live with only broken people in this world. And so it's just so much more realistic. I find a lot of idealism in the Christian messaging these days, promising people that if they just do this or do that or focus here or focus there, that they will be able to get on the other side of this particular problem forever. And, there are certain things that I'm on the other side of. I'm on the other side of my divorce from my first wife. I'm on the other side of some of the harder moments with my kids. I'm on the other side of a lot of things. But the fact of the matter is, I still on a daily basis struggle at some level with a low degree fever of sadness because of the hurt that I caused people that I love. The regret that I have about squandering what God had given me, opportunities lost, people who perhaps may question who God is because they looked up to me and I crashed and burned. I mean, there is a lot of that, which is why I say recovery is a lifelong process. I'm not on the other side of me. While I may be on the other side of certain problems, I'm not on the other side of me. And wherever I go, there I am, dealing with the same stuff that's been plaguing me for 50 years. And I think that honestly, that is the formula that God intended so that we stay tethered to his grace and keenly aware of how desperately we need it.
Yeah, I think it was Dallas Willard that talked about the idea that grace is really for us as Christians, and we burn through it like a 747 on jet fuel, right? And he actually talked about the 12 steps, like one of the greatest gifts to mankind of the 20th century,
Absolutely.
Right? Because it is the model of the transformational process. Like if you want to know how to do Christian, just live, eat, and breathe the 12 steps, because that's what it is.
Dude,
yeah.
I could not agree with you more. Not agree with you more. And that is something I did not know until after I crashed and burned. My wife, Stacy, was a facilitator. She went through Celebrate Recovery herself years ago, and then became a facilitator. And I was familiar with the 12 steps because of people that I was associated with before. And then when we met and we were sort of comparing notes, and she was telling me a little bit about Celebrate Recovery, which I was very familiar with. But as we looked at it more carefully, we realized this is a bit too sanitized of a 12-step program. Like it's promising victory in ways that I'm not sure we can promise in good faith to people. And so, looking at the 12 steps and going, okay, how do I read these through the lens of the gospel? How do I read these through the lens of grace? Has been massive for me. It's been massive for our church. It's been massive for my wife. Being able to wake up every day and admit and acknowledge to yourself that I need help. Whether you wake up in the morning feeling strong and vibrant or wake up in the morning feeling sad and depressed, defeated and depressed. Regardless, waking up every day and going, I know I need help. My life apart from God is out of control. My life internally, my life externally is out of control. I need God's grace every second of the day in order for me to make it to the end of the day. And I just think there's something really, really healthy about that. It's like I said, it is a heavy dose of realism that is necessary and needed in a Christian world of idealism, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. You write about this kind of the devolving into kind of your own certainly failure, but the idea that so many people have of like, man, I could never do something like that. That could never happen to me. And you write about that, and just the idea, certainly, it's the confessions of an adulterous heart, and it's not necessarily about, adultery the way we think of it, but it's just the idea that, like, man, we have hearts that are prone to wander. And you talk about, the rage, one of the terms we work with, and kind of our just sexual brokenness is the idea of eroticized rage, and then entitlement, somehow when the other person is not treating me right, now I go victim and I'm entitled to go do whatever. And the things that kind of go into the recipe to get us to like ultimately just violate, our integrity, who we are. And boy, I think people have a hard time believing that somehow, that could actually happen to anybody because we're all human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I was shocked, to be honest with you, that I arrived at the place that I did. And it was only after everything, when I had time to reflect with good therapy, that I could see kind of the progression, the slow progression that got me to where I was. And it's so slow and it's so subtle that you don't see it at the time, or you might see little parts of it, but it doesn't look nearly as big as it is turning into. And I was surprised. I was also surprised by other people in my world, family members, colleagues who responded to all of this in a way that I never thought in a million years they would respond to this. And I do think that most people would be shocked that given the right set of circumstances at the right moment, you are capable of just about anything and everything. And Jesus alludes to that by saying basically everything vile that comes out of humanity is already in the heart. It's already there. We don't, thankfully, God's restraining grace keeps us from exercising that all the time. But I mean, it's all there. And I think that's what's so powerful about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is he really cuts through the outer behavior of a person and gets to the heart of the issue. When he says things like, you've heard it said that if you commit adultery, you're in big trouble. I tell you that if you have ever been lustful in your heart before God, you're just as in trouble. Or anger and murder being the same thing in the court of God, because it's a heart issue first. And so I think we become so fixated on behavior, bad behavior modification. We look at the fruit of the problem and we treat it as if it's the root of the problem, when in reality it goes much deeper than that. And I was talking to somebody very close to me, one of my children a few days ago, who's going through a really difficult time, and I was counseling him to go to his therapist, and we were talking about some of the things that are going on in his life. And I was talking about this need to really dive beneath the surface and get to the root of some of these things. And God bless him, so honestly, he's just a brutally honest kid, but so honestly, he said, I hear you, Dad, but to be honest with you, I'm really scared to go under the surface because I'm afraid of what I will find. And I'm like, dude, like that is so refreshing to hear that. So refreshing to hear that. Rather than someone going, I do go under the surface, or, what are you talking about? I mean, to say what he said, like I know I'm avoiding that because I'm afraid of what that will look like when I confront it. And I just, I think we need a lot more of that.
Tell us when's the book coming out? When's it going to be released?
So, it's available for pre-order now.
Okay.
Amazon, barnesandnoble.com, whatever, online, anywhere where books are found and sold. It's entitled, like you mentioned, Carnage Grace. The subtitle is Confessions of an Adulterous Heart. And it comes out March 5th. So, not too far from now. And I got my copies about maybe 3 weeks ago, held it in my hand for the first time. And was, to be honest with you, overwhelmed. In a lot of ways, I was overwhelmed. in some ways, I was overwhelmed by how underwhelmed I was. I don't know exactly what I expected to happen when I finally held it in my hand. It's my 8th book, so it's not like I haven't written books before, but this is the first one I've written since 2014, and it's certainly the first one I've written since everything fell apart. So it's been, it's coming out 10 years after my last book, and if anybody's familiar with my previous books and they read this one, I think they'll see the message is the same, but the messenger is very different. And that's, that was sort of an inevitability. 10 years down the road, not only am I on the other side of that, that crash in 2015, but I'm 10 years older. I've had 10 more years to reflect on life and myself and all of the things that accompany divorce and failure and broken families and, all of addiction, all of that stuff. I've had time to reflect on, and I've had a lot of help from people, good people, that have helped me reflect on that stuff honestly and realistically. So I'm excited for people to read it. It's not PG, I will tell you that. It is, parental advisory, or what is it? Parental, whatever it is. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yes.
Yeah. It's not, it's not PG. It's raw. It's not graphic in any kind of classless way at all. And I don't name names of people. There are a few names that I name because those are names that have been in public as it concerns this situation also. But I don't name names. I don't talk about other people's sins. I talk about mine predominantly. But it's a story that I'm excited for people, both people of faith and people not of faith, to read. I think it's a good introduction to the fallenness and brokenness of humanity and the amazing grace of God in the face of it. That's what I'm hoping will happen, especially for people who are not of faith, who may have a twisted, somewhat caricatured understanding of who God is because of what they've heard Christians say. I'm really hoping that this will be a fresh introduction to who God really is. So we'll see.
Well, having read it, I think you certainly accomplished the goal. It is a book for humanity and just the realness of who we are as human beings. And man, thank you for being willing to join us again. And we'll probably do this again. It's kind of fun.
I think we should do it once a month. I know. I'm literally like, I love conversations like this with like-minded people who understand sort of, the human condition and how God's grace interacts with that. So, I always appreciate my conversations with you, Roan. Appreciate the invitation to come back on. Appreciate your kind words about the book. It was certainly a labor of love, and I'm grateful that that you had a chance to read it and thought it might be helpful. Mm-hmm. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Highly recommend. So, man, we will reconvene next time, my brother.
Sounds good.
Great having you on. Thanks, Tully.
Thanks, Ron.
Yep.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir.
To learn more about what you've heard today and to engage with the Sex, God, and Chaos team, visit sexgodchaos.com.